Picture a classroom with kids like these, 20 to 25, mostly smiling faces. At some point, you were probably one of them. I know that I was. So which one were you? I was the kid who liked to sit up front. I raised my hands a lot. I loved to get called on. I was sometimes called a teacher's pet. There was another name for school-loving kids like me back then. It's something starting with an N. Anyone? Nerd, yeah. There are probably nerds like me in this photo, too. Other kids might have different labels, like artsy, or popular, or jock. Then there are the school personas, the class clown, the hyper kid, the weirdo. Sometimes you can tell who's who just from looking at a photo, but not usually. Those labels that we still have for kids, usually come from the way that they behave versus our expectation of what is normal. Do they act normally? Do they behave the way the teacher hopes they will? Do they behave differently from everybody else? In this photo, chances are that at least 5 of these kids are in some way not normal. And those kids with the label of not normal will likely be perceived by their teachers, their peers, maybe even their parents, as not okay for the way that they're not fitting in. These kids might also have the label of teacher's pet or popular, but it's more likely that their labels will be things like disruptive, bully, dummy, troublemaker, and we can't forget weird. Giving names and categories to things is something that our brains naturally do. Researchers from NYU have shown that categorization is actually necessary for survival. In the simplest of terms, it's how we differentiate rocks from food, for example. But do the categories that we assign and the terminology we use when describing people matter in the long run? Definitely. And the benchmarks we use for normal when assigning those categories, they matter a lot. I use the term differently wired to describe the estimated more than 1 billion people on Earth with neurological variations such as ADHD, autism, giftedness, learning disabilities, sensory processing disorder, anxiety. It also describes people with no formal diagnosis, but they're moving through the world in a unique way. It describes people who are often considered not normal because their behavior is not what we've all been conditioned to expect from people. When it comes to identifying neurodifferences in kids, there's a focus on getting really specific, which is great. The specific information gives us a deeper sense of what's going on, and it helps us have a better idea of what kind of support might help a child thrive. But what if, from time to time, we started seeing and treating different people like they were all the same? I know that might sound a little strange to suggest, but just hear me out for a moment. So think about the differently wired people in your world. Chances are that at least 1 in 5 of you here in this room is differently wired yourself. Chances are way higher that every single one of us has at least one child in our life who is differently wired or is raising one ourselves. So what would happen if we started thinking of atypical people as differently wired? Categorizing with a label that embraces uniqueness, explains differences, and positively includes 1/5 of the population in a way that makes atypical people just another brand of normal. This is my son, Asher. Well, he's 6 in this photo. He's 14 now. And I know him as mom, but come on, he's exceptionally adorable. If you had seen this kid in that class photo I showed earlier, what label would you have given him? Quiet, cooperative, good student? If so, you would not have been in alignment with his teachers. Already by the time this photo was taken, Asher had been labeled disruptive, unusual, intense, challenging. He was a kid who not only colored outside the lines, but he would just scrap the coloring project altogether and probably design a 3D interactive model instead. By the time he was in second grade, he was in his third school in 3 years, having been phased out of the first two. What I know about kids and raising someone like Asher is that for me, I really had to learn how to change my expectations for who he would be as a student and as my son. And that was really challenging for me. But what was the most challenging part by far was having this hilarious, I'll go back to that photo of him, this hilarious, thoughtful, creative little boy being labeled the bad kid. Having him being kicked out of the classroom and sent to the principal's office because it was easier than figuring out solutions for behavior that the teachers just didn't understand. So here's what that looks like for kids like Asher. Kids like Asher are regularly kicked out of school, even those that believe in inclusion, because their way of being is seen as non-compliant or too disruptive. We medicate many differently wired kids just to get them through the school day. They are stigmatized, they're bullied, they get told day in and day out that they are broken or they're wrong. They have to conform to fit in. They aren't allowed to learn the way that they learn. They are more likely than neurologically typical kids to end up in prison someday. The bottom line is that the current paradigm does not acknowledge, support, or embrace who these kids inherently are. But they're not the only ones who pay the price. Ultimately, we all will. Because here's the thing. Do you remember when you graduated from school and you went on to college or to work? So for me, I came here to Penn State. That's a little embarrassing photo to show today. And I pretty much instantly shed that teacher's pet nerd label, mostly. But I found new ways to be myself and to thrive. Now, hopefully that same thing happened to all of us when we left school. Well, that same identity shift happens for differently wired kids too. But for many of them, losing that feeling of being the bad kid or not smart will be very challenging. But once they're free from the confines of an educational system that reward conformity, they may no longer be troublemakers or even weird. For a handful of these kids, their extraordinary gifts, their unique creativity, their analytical skills, or their unusual way of approaching problems will come out into the open and they'll be able to thrive. That's what happened with John Green. He has OCD and anxiety. His label in school might have been socially challenged. And today he's a hugely popular author of young adult fiction, and he and his brother are revolutionizing education through their Crash Course YouTube channel. Richard Branson. His label might have been a bad student because of his poor performance due to his ADHD and his dyslexia. He, of course, went on to found the Virgin Group, and today is one of Britain's wealthiest billionaires. Steve Jobs might have been labeled a disciplinary problem, Bill Gates bored, and a troublemaker. Neither really thrived in school. Both dropped out of college. I think we know how that worked out for them. Temple Grandin, she was labeled disruptive and was kicked out of school when she was 14. She went on to earn a PhD in animal science, and today is still one of the most powerful voices out there, changing the stigma associated with autism. You see, the thing about having a different brain is that it comes with uniquely different gifts. And these are often the same gifts that leaders and pioneers possess. But this is still a secret to a lot of people. And it's a secret that we all have to start letting everyone else in on. Because the way that we've been going has been leading these kids to those outcomes I mentioned earlier: the isolation, depression, burnout, even jail. To help neurologically atypical kids develop into self-actualized adults, we have to change the way we see and support differently wired people. We have to stop marginalizing this population and instead redefine the way the rest of us define normal. So please, the next time and every time you experience a differently wired person in your world, try treating them like someone with a gift. The next time that you encounter a differently wired person and you hear someone talking about being normal, call them out on it in a nice way. I mean, seriously, what even is normal? And who the heck is aspiring to be that anymore? So the secret is now out. Let's see where this revolution takes us. Thank you.